Spring has finally arrived in Minnesota, so with the opening of the outdoor archery range near my house, I'm shifting from the large diameter indoor target shafts to the very small outdoor shafts. And I've had several questions from people asking me, what's the difference between the large and the small? Why would you use one over the other? So I thought I would take a minute and just create a little video and demonstrate, or show rather, some of the features and the differences between these two arrows. The most important thing to understand in the understanding why you would want to use one arrow versus the other is simply the most significant difference, which is the diameter of the shafts. In the top arrow here, this is a Gold Tip XXX Pro shaft. It is the largest shaft that's allowed under the rules for indoor or I think even most outdoor archery. And it's designed this way because in target archery, if you're able to hit the line on the target, you get the next highest, you get the higher point value. And so a lot of archers believe that there's an advantage in having really thick shafts because it increases the likelihood that you'll catch a line. In fact, many people call these shafts line cutters, so that you are increasing the odds that you'll nick that line and therefore get the higher points. So indoors, where there's no wind resistance, where speed of the arrow is less of an issue, then you don't really have a penalty for having these large shafts indoors when you're out of the wind, and so you take advantage of the extra diameter to try to catch a line. The bottom arrow, that's a Nano Force arrow shaft from Victory. This is a couple years old now. They call them VAPs, or Victory Armor Piercing shafts. These are quite small. They're not the smallest that you can get, but these small diameter shafts have advantages outside in the wind. You can imagine that if there's a strong crosswind, having a smaller area for the wind to blow against means that the arrow is going to be blown off course less readily. The other advantage is that the arrows are lighter, they travel faster, and the less time in the air, the less opportunity there is for the wind to push the arrow right or left. And so outdoors, when you have to worry about the wind, then you give up the advantage of cutting a line in favor of the advantage of having less effect on the wind. So these two cases, the Gold Tip arrow and the Victory arrow, different arrows for different purposes, and let's take a look at some of the other differences between them. You can see that the shaft diameter isn't the only difference between these two arrows, and in fact the differences in the fletching correspond for indoor and outdoor to the advantages or disadvantages that each one would present. The Gold Tip arrow, the one on the top, has 4-inch parabolic feathers, and those are gateway feathers. It has a pin bushing in the back, and a Gold Tip HD pin nock. The advantage here is that you don't want, these arrows are pretty expensive. And so if you were to happen to Robin Hood an arrow, that is, shoot one arrow into the back of the other, the pin nock, this little piece right here, means that the arrow is not really hollow in the back. It's hollow, but there's a bushing inside, so that if another arrow hits it like this, it will be deflected off, and it won't Robin Hood or go inside the other arrow. So that's an advantage when you're shooting with expensive arrows. So the 4-inch feathers, their advantage there is when you're shooting indoors and you only have a 20-yard shot typically, you need to have large feathers in order to correct the flight of the arrow. You don't have a lot of time in the air for the arrows to have their effect. Sometimes when the arrow leaves the bow, it may be flexing or varying in its flight path, and the purpose of the arrows on the back is to correct that with the air resistance and produce a straighter flight. And if the arrow is only in flight for 20 yards, you don't have a lot of time to make that correction. And so typically indoors you'll see archers use large feathers or large vanes to make that correction quickly. On the bottom arrow with the smaller vanes, these are plastic vanes rather than the feathers. These are 1 3/4 inch long vanes. And outdoors, when you're firing your arrows typically over larger distances, you have more time for the vanes to correct the flight of the arrow, and in fact you prefer smaller vanes because they have less wind resistance, and so it reduces the speed of the arrow less over the entire flight time of the arrow. And so the purposes are really quite opposite. Large feathers, when you don't have a lot of time to make that flight correction, you need to do it quickly when you have short distances, And over long distances, you can get away with smaller vanes, and it reduces the speed of the arrow considerably when you do that. The final difference is just between the points on the arrows. Both of these arrows shafts have field points, that is target points, not the large broadheads that you might use for hunting. In the case of the top arrow, the gold tip, that's a 150 grain point, and in the bottom one that's just a 100 grain point. Really the same function, just different sizes. Overall, the top arrow is 462 grains. That's just under 30 grams, just over 1 ounce. The bottom arrow is 323 grains, and so it's just a little over 20 grams and about 0.74 ounces. So a fairly large difference in the weight of the different arrows, and it produces quite a different speed too. Out of my bow, shooting the exact same bow, the large arrows, the gold tips, will fire at a speed of about 240 feet per second. That's 164 miles per hour. The smaller, lighter VAP arrows shoot at about 271 feet per second, which is 185 miles per hour. So there's a substantial difference in the speed of the arrows just based on the slightly more than 100 grains of weight difference. So I hope this little explanation was helpful. Each of these arrows has a very specific purpose, and you'll find a lot of archers have a set of each when they move indoors to outdoors and then back again when the cold weather comes.